The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. It had started with laughter, cruel, careless laughter that echoed off the marble columns of the 4th District Court like a slap to the face. Judge Harrington, broad-shouldered and white-haired, leaned back in his seat, chuckling low in his throat as he glanced down at the frail man in the threadbare coat standing at the defendant's table. A homeless man, the judge muttered under his breath, but not quietly enough. Representing himself? Are you? No. Who's foolish enough to step in for this one? The bailiff looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. The courtroom spectators, mostly lawyers waiting their turn, a few reporters in cheap suits, and the usual board clerks, watched with vague amusement. The man standing next to the defendant hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Judge Harrington rolled his eyes and waved a dismissive hand toward the silent representative. Well, state your name for the record. Let's move this circus along. The man finally stepped forward. He was tall, composed, dark-skinned with streaks of silver at his temples. His charcoal suit was expensive but modest, and the way he held himself, calm, confident, unshaken, demanded attention without saying a word. Then he said 5 words that turned the room to ice. I'm Supreme Court Justice Wallace. The judge froze. The bailiff dropped his pen. A sharp inhale rippled across the room like a wave of electricity. Judge Harrington's mouth opened slightly, then closed. For a moment, his face twitched with disbelief. Then with something else, fear, maybe. No one spoke. The silence screamed. And the man, the homeless black man at the center of the case, turned slowly to look up at the judge, his eyes dark pools of something deeper than rage. Something older. Something final. And then the power went out. 3 months earlier, the same man lay curled beneath a graffiti-covered viaduct on the south side of Chicago. The November wind sliced through the alley like a blade, carrying with it the stench of garbage and old grease. His name was Michael Reed, though most people just called him Ghost. Nobody asked why. They just accepted it. He wrapped the fraying blanket tighter around his shoulders and lit a half-smoked cigarette he'd salvaged from the sidewalk. Across from him, a rusted shopping cart held everything he owned. 2 shirts, a dented Bible, a stack of library books he was halfway through reading, and a photograph folded so many times it was starting to fall apart. In the photo, a woman and a little girl smiling on a sunny porch. You couldn't tell from the image, but Michael had taken it the day before the accident. The day before the fire. Before everything fell apart. Back then, he had been a high school teacher. History. Well-liked. Reliable. Proud. His wife, Dana, was a nurse. Their daughter, Amari, had just started 1st grade. They lived in a modest bungalow with a rose garden out front and a swing in the backyard. Michael had been the kind of man who always showed up on time, who paid his bills, who taught his students about Reconstruction and the civil rights movement like it was personal, because it was. And then flames. Smoke. Screams. The house went up in minutes. A faulty heater. A lawsuit no one won. Dana died in the blaze. Amari lived, but not with him. After the funeral, Michael stopped eating. Stopped going to work. The city took his daughter. Said he was unstable. Said he couldn't care for her. Said they were doing what was best. He tried fighting it, at first. But the courts didn't listen. His court-appointed attorney had called him too emotional. Said he was making people uncomfortable. Said he was intimidating. 3 months later, Michael was on the streets. Now, every morning, he walked 5 miles to the Harold Washington Library. He read everything he could. Law books, case studies, old newspaper articles. Not because he thought it would change anything, but because it gave him something to do. Something to fight the numbness. That's where he met her. Naomi Temple. She was a 3rd-year law student doing community outreach. A 26-year-old black woman with dreadlocks down her back and fire in her eyes. She saw him reading Gideon versus Wainwright and sat down next to him without asking. You ever think about representing yourself? She asked. He looked up slowly. For what? Getting your daughter back. Getting justice. Michael laughed, bitter and low. A homeless man with no money, no address, and no lawyer? They won't even let me in the courtroom. Naomi had smiled then. They will if you have me. It started slow. She'd meet him twice a week in the library. She'd sneak him printouts, copies of legal guides, pro bono resources. They'd practice arguments, review family court transcripts. And slowly, Michael began to believe again. Not in the system, but in the possibility, the smallest possibility, that he could still make them listen. Then came the arrest. A shopkeeper accused Michael of stealing a protein bar. No witnesses. No security footage. Just a black man with a blanket wrapped around him and a cart full of books. Easy to blame. The police didn't ask questions. They shoved him to the ground, cuffed him, and took him in. Michael didn't cry. He didn't scream. But Naomi did. She was there within the hour, shouting at the front desk, demanding answers. When they told her he'd be arraigned in 3 days, she called everyone she knew. But when they told her the case had been transferred to Judge Harrington's courtroom, her face went pale. "He's dangerous," she said. "He hates people like us." Michael just nodded. In the holding cell, he sat with his head down, knees drawn to his chest. He didn't care about the petty theft charge, not really. He had no record, no history of violence. But he knew this wasn't about a candy bar. This was about silencing him, keeping him invisible. But Naomi had other plans. She disappeared for 2 days, didn't return his calls, didn't show up at the library. He thought she'd given up. Then, just hours before the hearing, she arrived at the jail. But she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a tall man in a charcoal suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his eyes cold and sharp as glass. He didn't speak to Michael at first, just sat across from him and studied him, like he was reading a puzzle. "Naomi tells me you've read Gideon versus Wainwright 4 times, the man finally said. Michael nodded. "She tells me you quote Brown versus Board like scripture." Michael looked up. "And she tells me you're ready to make them see you. Really see you." A pause. "I used to believe that was possible," Michael said. "Now? I don't know." The man didn't smile. "Then let's make them remember." "What's your name?" Michael asked. The man stood, buttoned his jacket. "I'm Justice Isaiah Wallace. And I'm representing you." Michael stared at him. "But you're—" "I'm here now," Wallace said. "That's all that matters." Michael didn't ask questions, didn't argue. He just nodded. And when the guards came to take him to court, he stood a little taller. The courtroom was crowded. Whispers followed them as they walked in. Michael kept his head high. Wallace said nothing. And then Judge Harrington laughed. Until Wallace stepped forward. And the courtroom shattered. Then, the lights flickered. The room went dark. And someone screamed. The scream cut through the courtroom like a jagged blade. Then silence, dense and suffocating. A few phones flashed on. Their blue-tinted glows bobbed in the dark, barely illuminating panicked faces and gaping mouths. Somewhere in the back, a chair scraped violently against the floor as someone scrambled to leave. But the doors wouldn't budge. The security locks had sealed with the power outage. Michael stood frozen, heart slamming against his ribs. His hands clenched instinctively, not in fear, but in preparation. For what, he didn't know. Beside him, Justice Wallace didn't flinch. "I suggest," Wallace said, voice low and calm in the dark, "that we all remain still until the backup power kicks in." What the hell is going on?" the prosecutor blurted out. "I'd guess someone doesn't want this hearing to happen," Wallace replied smoothly, his silhouette still upright and unshaken in the gloom. "The timing is convenient." Just then, the red glow of emergency lights buzzed to life. Weak, flickering strips along the floor cast eerie shadows against the marble columns. Judge Harrington sat stiffly at the bench, one hand gripping his gavel like it might save him. "Get the building engineer in here now," he barked at the bailiff, who stood just inside the door, pale and unmoving. The power outage had lasted less than 90 seconds, but the damage was done. Every person in that room had felt it, something deeper than fear. A shift, because now they all knew who Michael Reed had standing next to him. And the court, which had laughed at him moments ago, now listened with bated breath. 3 months earlier, Michael had spent Thanksgiving alone beneath the viaduct. He had saved a half-rotten sandwich from the church handout the day before, took tiny bites to make it last. The cold was crueler than usual, the kind that sank into bones and memories. Around him, the city buzzed with warmth and food and family, a world he no longer belonged to. But even then, he didn't cry. Instead, he wrote. It had become a quiet ritual, one of the only things that gave his days shape. He found scraps of paper, receipts, napkins, whatever he could use. He wrote letters to Amari. Not the kind you send. The kind you pray someone will read someday. Dear Mari, one read. I miss the way you laughed when you beat me at Uno. I miss your bedtime stories. I miss your mother's voice in the kitchen. I'm trying, baby girl. I swear I'm trying. When Naomi found him again, it was 3 days after Thanksgiving. She brought him a styrofoam container of leftovers and sat with him on the cold sidewalk, ignoring the stares. "You're writing again," she said, spotting the stack of napkins beside him. "I never stopped." "You're going to need that," she said. "For what's coming." "What do you mean?" She hesitated. Then she pulled out a thick manila folder and handed it to him. Inside were documents. Michael's file, old court transcripts, visitation records. But there was something else, a motion for review, with Naomi's name on it as petitioner. "I filed an appeal for your custody case," she said. "And I found out something strange." She showed him a section from his family court transcript, a line where the judge had referenced a mental health evaluation Michael never took. "This judge ruled you unfit based on a report that doesn't exist. It's fake. I think someone forged it." Michael stared at the page. The black and white lie of it burned his eyes. "Why would they do that?" Naomi exhaled. "Because you're not supposed to win, Michael. The system isn't built for people like you." He nodded slowly. "I know." "No," she said fiercely. "Not like this. Not with fake reports and buried evidence. That's not just bias. That's a cover-up." It was that night, under flickering streetlights and the hum of passing cars, that Michael looked her in the eye and said, "Then let's burn it down." And Naomi had smiled, fierce and proud. The next week, she brought in reinforcements. At first, Michael thought it was just a kind stranger. A man in a crisp suit, quiet but sharp-eyed, sitting in the back of the library. He didn't say much, just watched them. Then, slowly, he began asking Michael questions. "Do you know what a Brady violation is?" "Yes." "Ever heard of Turner versus Rogers?" "Due process and civil contempt." "Yes." Each question was harder, more obscure, and each time, Michael answered without hesitation. The man finally nodded and said, "You're ready." Michael looked at Naomi. She smiled. "That's Isaiah Wallace," she said. "He used to clerk for Thurgood Marshall. He sits on the Supreme Court now." Michael felt the room tilt. "He's what? Why would he be here?" "Because," Wallace said, "I've been watching your case from a distance. And because sometimes the law needs reminding of what justice looks like." Now, in the emergency-lit courtroom, Michael stood taller. He could feel the weight of every night spent cold and forgotten. Every time someone had crossed the street to avoid him. Every time a caseworker told him he was unstable, too angry, not suitable. He carried those memories like armor now. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Let the record show the appearance of Justice Isaiah Wallace on behalf of the defendant." The court clerk fumbled with her pen. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, sweat now glistening at his temple. Wallace stepped forward, tone like steel wrapped in silk. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss the theft charge on grounds of false arrest, lack of evidence, and malicious prosecution." The judge blinked. "On what basis?" Wallace smiled, not kindly. "On the basis that the store owner in question was coached to file a false report. And we have the audio to prove it." A gasp ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection. That's not." "It's admissible," Wallace said, handing a flash drive to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I suggest we listen. The truth has waited long enough." Judge Harrington hesitated. His reputation was already on the line. Cameras were in the back now. One reporter held up their phone, filming every second. If he blocked this, there would be questions. Investigations. "Play the recording," he muttered. The bailiff inserted the drive into the courtroom monitor. A few seconds of static. Then a voice, grainy, but clear. "Look, you just say he stole something. They won't ask questions. He's one of them. Dirty, loud, always hanging around. Just give them a reason to take him." Michael's breath caught. The voice was unmistakable. The store owner. And a second voice, a man's, coaxing him, feeding him lines. Likely a police officer. The one who arrested him. Wallace let the silence linger after the audio ended. Then he stepped back. "Dismiss the case," he said, "and reopen his custody hearing. Or we go to federal court." The judge didn't speak. Couldn't. And then, just as he raised his gavel, the courtroom door burst open. Two federal marshals strode in. And behind them, Amari. She was taller now. Her braids were longer, her eyes wide with shock. Michael turned. His daughter was standing in front of him. And for a moment, just a moment, the world fell away. Then the lead marshal spoke. "We have a sealed order from the circuit court. We're reopening the custody case. Effective immediately." And everything changed. Michael couldn't breathe. His daughter, his daughter, was standing in the doorway of the courtroom, her small hands still gripped tightly by the federal marshal who had escorted her in. She was no longer the 6-year-old with gaps in her teeth and scraped knees. Now she was 9, taller, a little thinner. Her eyes, once bubbling with mischief and joy, were wide with confusion. The silence broke as she whispered, barely audible, "Daddy?" Michael took a step forward, unsure whether he was dreaming. His legs felt unsteady, his chest too tight. He didn't care about protocol, or judges, or the blazing white lights that had finally flickered back on overhead. He dropped to his knees. "Amari," he choked. She let go of the marshal's hand and ran into his arms. The entire courtroom sat frozen in the unrehearsed holiness of that moment. The judge, the prosecutors, the clerks, no one dared interrupt it. Justice Wallace watched silently, his expression unreadable but eyes misted with something only a father could recognize. Michael held Amari like she was air, like she was the only thing keeping him alive. His hands trembled as he touched her hair, her face. "You're here. You're okay. Baby girl, I missed you so much." Her small fingers clutched the collar of his coat. "I thought you didn't want me anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Michael said, pulling her tighter. "No, that's what they told you, isn't it? They lied. I've never stopped trying. I wrote to you every day. I never got them." "I know," he said, breaking. Behind them, the judge cleared his throat, finally regaining some composure. "Mr. Reed, I understand the emotional circumstances, but we need to." Justice Wallace cut him off. "Your Honor, with respect, you've had your turn to speak. Now you will listen." The courtroom snapped to attention. "I move for a formal investigation into Judge Harrington's conduct, and I request immediate relief to Michael Reed regarding custody of his daughter. This child was wrongfully removed under fabricated pretenses, and we now have sufficient evidence of a conspiracy to keep them apart." The judge paled. I didn't know," Harrington stammered. Wallace didn't blink. "You chose not to know." The doors opened again, and this time a tall woman in a gray suit entered with swift purpose. Her heels clacked against the tile floor like punctuation marks. Everyone turned. "This is Special Investigator Lila Harper from the Office of Judicial Conduct," Wallace announced. "And she's had enough of this courthouse's rot." Judge Harrington stood, lips parted. "You can't." "Oh, I can," Harper said crisply. "Your Honor, you are now under formal review. You'll remove yourself from any further proceedings involving Mr. Reed effective immediately." The judge's mouth opened, closed. He sat. Michael, still holding Amari, whispered into her ear, "We're going home soon, baby." But Amari pulled back. Her eyes flickered to Naomi, then to Wallace, then to Michael. "Where is home now?" He didn't have an answer. Not yet. That night, Michael and Amari sat in a sterile interview room at a foster agency downtown. It wasn't a reunion suite. No soft lighting, no warm colors, no soft couch for emotional healing. Just a metal table, white walls, and buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. Still, Michael didn't care. He had her, even if only for tonight. She sat across from him, now quieter than he remembered. The trauma of years in foster care, being told he had abandoned her, being passed around like a case file, had left cracks in her voice. But her eyes still held questions. Sharp ones. "Did you stop loving me?" she asked again. Michael shook his head, pain bleeding into every word. "I loved you too much to stop. I didn't fight hard enough at first, but then I learned how. I read every book I could. I even got help from someone on the Supreme Court, baby. I'm here because I never gave up on you." She nodded slowly, still processing. "Then, where's Mom?" Michael closed his eyes. "She's gone, Mari. I thought maybe she was with you. I wish." She lowered her eyes, then quietly whispered, "I remember the fire." Michael reached across the table and gently took her hand. "I'm so sorry, baby. I should have saved her. I should have saved you both." "You saved me," she whispered. "I don't remember how, but I know you did." They sat there in silence, holding on to the only thing that hadn't burned away, each other. Back at Naomi's apartment later that night, Michael collapsed onto her couch. He was still in the same borrowed coat. Amari had been placed in a temporary care facility pending the new custody hearing. Wallace had returned to D.C. to prepare the formal case for the DOJ. Naomi stood over Michael with a glass of water. "You okay?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I saw her face," he finally said. "She's different." But she's still my baby. She loves you. That didn't change. He looked at her, eyes raw. Do you know how many nights I prayed she'd just remember me? That she wouldn't hate me? Naomi sat beside him. She never hated you, Michael. She was lied to. Like they lie to so many of us. He nodded slowly, exhaling. You brought her back, he said. Naomi smiled. No. You brought her back. You did the work. I just opened the door. There was a beat of quiet before Michael asked the question that had been burning all night. Why did Wallace come? Naomi hesitated. I didn't tell you everything, she said. Isaiah Wallace lost his own son to the system 20 years ago. Drugs. Racial profiling. A crooked judge. By the time he realized how far the corruption went, it was too late. He spent the last decade trying to balance the scales from the inside. Your story woke something in him. Michael let the weight of that settle in. So what happens now, he asked. Naomi didn't flinch. Now? We finish what we started. The investigation into Harrington's rulings will take weeks. But your case for custody starts again. With a new judge. With Wallace's testimony. With the truth on your side. Michael stared at the ceiling. I'm scared. You should be, Naomi said softly. That means you're still fighting. Just then, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Threats. Be careful. They're watching. She showed it to Michael without a word. His jaw tightened. And somewhere in the city, beneath a flickering street lamp, a man in a dark coat lit a cigarette and whispered into a burner phone. They're getting too close. Time to shut it down. The crackle of static whispered through the burner phone before a flat voice responded. Shut it down, how? The man in the dark coat flicked his cigarette onto the sidewalk and crushed it beneath his boot. The usual way. Naomi couldn't sleep. Her apartment was quiet, but her nerves refused to settle. She kept glancing at her phone, rereading the anonymous warning. Threats. Be careful. They're watching. Outside, wind scraped against her window panes like claws. She was used to the pressure. Law school had taught her how to think under stress. The nonprofit world had shown her how the system ground people down. But this was different. This was a threat. To her. To Michael. To Amari. And it wasn't vague anymore. It was personal. She sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her emails, searching for anything strange. An hour passed. Then two. At 3:17 a.m., she finally saw it. An undeliverable email alert from a server she hadn't contacted. A law enforcement database. Someone had used her credentials. Someone had accessed Michael's sealed juvenile file, one that had no relevance to his current custody case. Someone was digging, and they wanted dirt. At dawn, Naomi raced to the temporary foster center where Amari was staying, but the guard at the front desk stopped her cold. She's not here. Naomi blinked. What do you mean? I have clearance to visit. She was transferred here after the hearing. The guard looked at his clipboard, confused. Yeah, she was. But this morning, a man came with a court order. Took her. Naomi's stomach dropped. What man? Said he was from Child Protective Services. Do you have a name? Didn't give one. Just flashed a badge and left with her. White guy? Gray suit. Mid-40s. Naomi's throat clenched. Did you verify the order? He hesitated. It looked real. Naomi didn't wait. She sprinted out, dialing Wallace's secure line. He answered on the second ring. She's gone, she said. Someone took Amari pretending to be CPS. Silence. Then Wallace's voice turned to steel. Find Michael. Now. Michael was already pacing when Naomi arrived at her office. He hadn't slept either. One look at her face told him everything. No, he said, backing away. Don't say it. Naomi held his shoulders. They took her, Michael. But we're going to get her back. His knees buckled, and he dropped into a chair. No. No, no, no. He looked like a man watching the fire again, helpless to stop it, helpless to scream. Why would they do this? He asked, eyes wild. Why take her now? After all this. Because we embarrassed them, Naomi said. Wallace humiliated them. You survived what they designed to destroy you. And now they're scrambling. Michael stood suddenly. Then let's scramble back. Naomi stared at him. I want to go on the record, he said. I want to go public. With everything. They called in every reporter who had ever been kind to the cause. A community journalist from Bronzeville. An investigative blogger from Uptown. An NPR affiliate reporter Naomi had interned with. Michael sat in front of a camera in a clean shirt Naomi gave him. He had shaved. His eyes still held exhaustion, but something else too. Fire. Resolve. He told his story in full. From the fire that killed his wife, to the day he lost custody of Omari. He spoke about being homeless, about how no one would listen, about how the court system assumed he was guilty just for existing. He ended with one truth that stuck in every reporter's throat. I did everything they said would make me worthy, and they still tried to erase me. The video went viral within 6 hours. Hashtag Where is Omari trended within 12. But the victory was short-lived. That night, Naomi's car was broken into. Michael's sleeping spot under the viaduct was set on fire. His books were gone. And Wallace called with worse news. Judge Harrington had quietly filed a motion to seal all further proceedings involving the case, under the guise of protecting the child. They were locking Michael out again. Legally, Wallace arrived in Chicago the next morning. He met Naomi and Michael at a secure location inside a union hall. He looked more tired than usual. Even he, a Supreme Court justice, couldn't believe how quickly the machinery of corruption was fighting back. They're trying to silence the case before it ever hits federal court, he said. They've buried Omari somewhere in the system. Michael slammed his fist into the table. I want to see her. I want to hold her. I want her to know I didn't let them take her again. Wallace leaned forward, voice low and deadly calm. Then we bring them into the light. Naomi glanced between the two men. What are you saying? Wallace smiled grimly. We go public with everything. But not just a video. A hearing. One the world watches. A shadow hearing? Naomi asked. A public tribunal, Wallace clarified. They'll call it symbolic. Performative. But the truth will be documented. And people will listen. Michael stood slowly. Let's do it. 3 nights later, a makeshift tribunal was set up in a local black church. The same church where Michael and Dana were married years ago. The pews were packed with neighbors, clergy, students, lawyers, and organizers. A live stream was set up. Wallace sat at the center table like a presiding judge. Naomi moderated. Michael took the stand. He told his story again, this time with documents, names, transcripts. Then Naomi called in character witnesses, Dana's sister, Omari's old teacher, even the social worker who had first flagged the irregularities in Michael's original custody case. Each one spoke with quiet fury. Then came the final testimony. A woman entered wearing dark glasses and a hoodie. Everyone in the room turned. She lowered her hood. Gasps rippled. It was the foster parent who had cared for Omari for almost 2 years. I was paid to lie, she said into the mic. They told me to say Michael never visited. But he did. Every week, he came to the fence, holding a letter. I wasn't allowed to give them to Omari. Michael wept. She continued, hands shaking. I'm sorry. I knew it was wrong. But they threatened my license, my family. I'm here now because I couldn't sleep anymore. Wallace nodded solemnly. Thank you. He turned to Michael. The world heard you. Now we move the fight to Washington. But before the night could end, Naomi's phone buzzed again. A text from the same anonymous number. They're moving Omari tonight. You have 2 hours. She showed Michael. His jaw set. Wallace stood. Let's go get your daughter. 2 hours later, they arrived at a private psychiatric facility outside the city. It wasn't on the CPS database. But the source had been right. Inside, behind locked doors, in a clean, windowless room, Omari sat alone, arms folded, staring at the floor. She looked up as the door opened. Daddy. Michael stepped inside, breath caught in his throat. I'm here, baby. I'm here. She ran to him. The room erupted in shouts as guards arrived, but Wallace stepped forward with a federal court order, an emergency injunction signed by a judge he knew personally. Try and stop us, he said coldly. And they didn't. Michael lifted Omari into his arms. Naomi took a picture. That photo would be on the front page of the New York Times the next morning. Father and daughter, reunited in defiance. But as they drove away from the facility in Naomi's borrowed car, none of them saw the black SUV that followed them down the road. The black SUV trailed them at a measured distance, not close enough to alarm, but not far enough to go unnoticed. Naomi kept checking the rearview mirror, her knuckles pale against the steering wheel. They've been behind us since the turnpike, she said quietly. Wallace sat in the passenger seat, eyes narrowed. Plate's government issue. Likely unmarked agency. We're being watched. In the back, Michael held Omari tight, his body coiled with protective instinct. Omari, nestled against his chest, whispered, Are they bad people? Michael looked down at her, heart thudding like a war drum. They're scared people, baby. scared of what happens when we speak the truth. Naomi turned the car off the main road and ducked into a gas station lot. She parked beside a delivery truck and killed the lights. The SUV rolled past slowly but didn't stop. She waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then she hit the gas and doubled back down a side street. "Where are we going?" Michael asked. "To a safe house," Wallace replied. "We have allies here." The safe house was an old brownstone on the city's west side, owned by a retired judge who had once been pushed off the bench for exposing police misconduct. The lights were off, the curtains drawn, and the windows reinforced. Inside, it smelled faintly of incense and old books. Michael laid Amari down on a couch and wrapped her in a blanket. She was exhausted, her small body limp with sleep, but her hand never let go of his shirt. Wallace handed Naomi a burner phone. "Call the contact in DC, tell them we'll send the files tonight. Then go dark. No emails, no calls. We can't risk interception." Naomi nodded. But Michael was still watching the window. "She shouldn't have to go through this," he said. "She should be in her bed. With her things. Her pictures. Her books." Wallace sat across from him. "That's what we're fighting for." Michael turned, eyes sharp. "No, I'm not fighting anymore. I'm winning." Wallace raised a brow. "I want to take this case all the way up," Michael said. "I want to file federal charges. Against the judge, CPS, the cops, everyone who helped cover this up." "You will," Wallace said. "But first, we keep her safe." Naomi returned from the hallway, her face pale. "They're planning to issue a failure to comply warrant for Michael, claiming he violated custody procedure. They're going to paint this as a kidnapping." Michael stood. "Then we don't wait." By morning, Michael was trending again. But this time, not as a victim. #Reed Rising was everywhere. The video of the shadow hearing, the testimony, the reunion at the facility, it all poured into the digital bloodstream. Activists across the country picked it up. Civil rights groups issued statements. The ACLU called for an investigation. Local news anchors tried to stay neutral. National outlets did not. Is Chicago's court system targeting black fathers? Homeless, harassed, and heard. The Michael Reed story. Supreme Justice takes on city corruption. By midday, protesters gathered outside the CPS headquarters, holding up photos of Michael and Amari. Chants of "Bring her home" echoed through the glass towers of downtown. Inside a smoky office miles away, Judge Harrington watched the coverage in silence. A younger man stood beside him, a lawyer, maybe, or a fixer. "You said he'd break," the man muttered. "That he'd disappear." "He was supposed to," Harrington said bitterly. The younger man glanced at the screen. "Now he's a symbol." Harrington stood, pacing. "Find out who leaked that file. Shut down the safe house. Do whatever it takes. Because if he walks into that federal courthouse and wins, he's not just a symbol. He's a weapon." That night, back at the safe house, Michael wrote a letter. Not for court. Not for the media. For Amari. He folded it carefully and slipped it into the journal Naomi had given her. Then he kissed her forehead and stepped into the kitchen. "I want to testify," he told Wallace. "Publicly. Live. In Washington." Wallace didn't argue. "We leave tomorrow. Private flight. Naomi and I have security lined up." Naomi looked up from her laptop. "I hacked into the CPS backend." Michael blinked. "You what?" She smiled faintly. "Don't worry, I covered my tracks. But I found something." She turned the screen. A file. Amari's name. And beneath it, a tag. Special category. Prevent reunification. Wallace went still. They flagged her. Before the first hearing. Naomi nodded. This wasn't just bias. It was targeted. Michael's voice was ice. "Why?" Naomi scrolled to the bottom of the page. A note from a DHS liaison. Handwritten, then scanned in. Read his activist history. Taught CRT. Monitored by Watch List since 2019. High risk if focal. Michael stepped back like he'd been struck. "That's why they came after me." Wallace nodded grimly. "You weren't just a case. You were a threat to their illusion of control." They left under cover of darkness. An old sedan picked them up. No headlights. No chatter. Just tense silence as the city shrank behind them. But the SUV returned. It appeared just outside the airport, again keeping distance, again refusing to close in. A shadow in the rearview mirror. Naomi glanced back. "They're waiting." Wallace handed Michael a passport. "New identity. Temporary. Just until the hearing." Michael shook his head. "No. They'll see my face. They'll know my name. I'm not hiding anymore. Wallace smiled faintly. Good. But just as they reached the private terminal, Michael's phone buzzed. One message. From a blocked number. She won't make it to DC unless you back off. Michael stared at the screen, blood pounding in his ears. He handed it to Wallace. Wallace read it and said one word. Trap. They sprinted into the hangar. The pilot was ready. Naomi carried Amari. Wallace watched the skies. But as the jet doors closed behind them, gunshots rang out, shattering glass in the hangar windows. Someone shouted, Down! Michael threw his body over Amari. Naomi hit the floor beside them. Wallace pulled a concealed firearm from his coat and fired a warning shot into the rafters. The sound echoed like thunder. Then silence. Sirens. Security forces flooded the scene. No one was hit. The attackers were gone. But they had sent a message. And Michael Reed had answered it. He stood slowly, looked at the bullet hole in the hangar wall, then at Amari, who clutched his sleeve. And with a calm he didn't feel, he whispered, They shot at the wrong family. The jet sliced through the sky above the eastern seaboard, streaking toward Washington, D.C., while the world below erupted in chaos. Inside, the cabin was quiet, too quiet. The engines hummed like distant thunder, but no one spoke. Michael sat beside Amari, her hand folded into his like an anchor. She hadn't said a word since the hangar. Naomi was across the aisle, a tablet in her lap, monitoring the news feeds. They're spinning it already, she said finally, calling it an isolated incident, unknown gunman. The footage inside the hangar's already gone. Michael didn't blink. Scrub? Yeah, clean. Like it never happened. Wallace leaned forward from his seat. They'll try to pin it on radicals or lone wolves. Anything but the truth. They don't want the public thinking government actors opened fire on a father trying to reach court. Naomi glanced at Michael. We've got maybe 24 hours before they bury this story. We need to move. Michael stared out the window. His voice was low, steady. I'm done letting them write the story. They landed just outside D.C. at a private strip, where Wallace had arranged transport and shelter. No fanfare. No press. Just black sedans and briefcases. The safe house this time was different, government-owned, protected by U.S. Marshals. Inside, they were greeted by two senior investigators from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. One was black, tall and thin with eyes like hard glass. The other was a Latina woman with a lanyard full of court credentials. Both were serious, prepared. You've shaken a tree with deep roots, the man said. We've been watching Harrington for years. But you, Michael, you brought us proof. Naomi handed over the encrypted flash drives. Testimonies. Sealed files. The CPS leak. It's all here. The woman investigator looked at Michael. Are you ready to testify in open session? I was born ready, he said. The next morning, the hearing took place inside a Senate committee room repurposed for emergency public session. The buzz outside was electric. Protesters gathered with signs. Reporters shoved microphones past barricades. Civil rights leaders, old and young, filled the gallery. The room hadn't been this packed since the last Supreme Court confirmation hearing. Amari was kept in protective custody nearby. Naomi stayed with her. Michael walked into the room with Wallace at his side. This was his moment. He took the stand. Flashes erupted from cameras. Murmurs swelled. Then silence. He began. My name is Michael Reed. I am a father. I am a teacher. And I am a man the system tried to erase. He told his story from beginning to end. The fire. The courts. The false report. The loss of his daughter. The arrest. The betrayal of the laws he had once taught his students to believe in. He spoke of the hunger. The loneliness. The way strangers crossed the street when they saw him. The way the court looked at his skin before they looked at his name. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He testified. I didn't break, he said, voice calm. I didn't disappear. And I didn't stop being Amari's father. The room was silent for a full minute after he finished. Then applause broke. Not loud, but raw and real. One of the senators leaned into the mic. Mr. Reed, are you aware that Judge Harrington is now under federal indictment for civil rights violations? Michael didn't flinch. Good. But the fight wasn't over. That night, Naomi returned to the safe house to check on Amari and found the door slightly ajar. Her heart stopped. She stepped inside slowly. Amari. Silence. Then, a thud from the back room. She ran. Amari sat curled in a corner, arms wrapped around her knees. There was a man outside, she whispered. He was looking at the window. I saw him. Naomi's blood went cold. She texted Wallace. They found us again. At 2 a.m., Wallace received an encrypted message from a contact deep inside federal surveillance. There's a leak. Someone in DOJ. They're feeding info to Harrington's people. He sent it to Naomi immediately. Naomi replied. Then we go public with everything. No more secrets. The next morning, Naomi released everything. Not just Michael's files, but her own investigation. The doctored CPS reports. The fake psychiatric eval. The sealed court orders with forged signatures. Within hours, it was all over the news. Congress opened an emergency oversight investigation into the Chicago family court system. The president issued a statement calling Michael Reed's case a mirror held up to the soul of our justice system. And the very judge who once laughed at Michael now sat in a courtroom himself, flanked by lawyers, pale and humiliated. But Michael didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was walking into the final custody hearing in Chicago 2 days later, with Wallace at his side, Naomi in the gallery, and Amari holding his hand. The new judge, a black woman with tired eyes and the weight of justice in her shoulders, took one look at Michael and said, Mr. Reed, it's been a long road. Yes, Your Honor, he said. But you're here. He nodded. I'm here. The judge looked at Amari, then back at Michael. Do you still wish to regain full custody? Michael's voice cracked. With all my heart. She reviewed the evidence. This time, real evidence. She read the letters Michael wrote. She looked at the CPS employee who testified that Michael was blacklisted. She read aloud the note that Amari had slipped her, scrawled in crayon and fear. Please let me go home to my dad. The judge closed the file, then smiled, not wide, but full of grace. I rule in favor of Michael Reed. The gavel struck. Michael collapsed into Amari's arms. The courtroom rose to its feet. Wallace wiped his eyes. Naomi whispered to herself, We did it. But just as they stepped outside into the sunlight, father and daughter free at last, a black car rolled by. Inside, behind dark glass, a figure in a suit watched them. He picked up a phone. They won this one. But we're not finished. The celebration outside the courthouse was thunderous. Cheers echoed down the block, swallowed up by the tall buildings like thunder bouncing through a canyon. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted Michael's name. Supporters chanted, Reed is free, as confetti drifted through the air like soft snowfall. Michael didn't hear any of it. All he could see was Amari. She was laughing now, real laughter. The first he'd heard in years. It shook something loose in him. Something buried. He picked her up and spun her around under the glare of 100 lenses. She shrieked with joy, her arms wrapped around his neck. We did it, Daddy, she squealed. Yeah, he whispered, tears slipping down his cheeks. We did. Naomi watched them from the courthouse steps, arms crossed, face calm, but her eyes shimmered. Wallace stood beside her, his suit immaculate despite the long night. This is why we fight, he said. But Naomi's smile faded. They'll come again, she said low. I know. Wallace turned to her, face tight. And we'll be ready. 3 hours later, they were back at Naomi's apartment. The curtains were drawn. The security system she'd installed last month blinked red at every window. Michael sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, Amari's request. She devoured hers like it was the best meal she'd ever had. Tomorrow, Michael said between bites, we're going to the library. You can show me what you've been reading. And maybe we stop for ice cream. Amari beamed. Can we get the rainbow kind? Anything you want. Naomi leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Then her phone buzzed. A single message. From an encrypted source she hadn't heard from in months. They're planning a move. Names. Locations. You're on it too. Her fingers tightened on the phone. Michael saw her face and stood up. What's wrong? She turned the screen to show him. He read the message. Then again. And then he sat back down, slow and heavy. They don't stop, he said. Naomi nodded. No. They just changed the angle. That night, while Amari slept, Naomi and Wallace went over the documents one more time. The leak wasn't just inside the Department of Justice. It was bigger, deeper, buried in a network of private contractors, nonprofit organizations, and court-affiliated lobbying groups. Wallace traced one signature on a CPS memo to a firm with links to 2 sitting senators. This wasn't just a mistake, Naomi said. This was strategic, coordinated. To break him, Wallace agreed. to make an example of a black man who dared to challenge the system. They failed. For now. He pulled out a thick envelope. I filed the first brief for a class action civil rights suit. We'll call it Reed versus State of Illinois. But we'll need others. Families. Witnesses. Whistleblowers. Naomi exhaled. I know just where to start. But they didn't realize someone else was already starting. Across town, inside an anonymous brick office building, a meeting was underway. 5 men. 1 woman. No names used. Just code names. Laptops. Quiet, deadly language. Reed has become a symbol, one said. We underestimated his reach. Symbolic figures can be destroyed, another replied. The woman, seated at the head of the table, looked through a manila folder filled with surveillance photos. Michael. Amari. Naomi. Wallace. Not destroyed, she said. Discredited. She pointed to Naomi's photo. This one. Find out where she came from. Every school, every file. Everyone she's ever helped. Then to Wallace. He's harder. But he has secrets. Then to Michael. Her eyes narrowed. We don't need to kill him. Just break him again. Quietly. Back at Naomi's apartment, Michael dreamed restlessly. The fire again. But this time, he couldn't get to Amari in time. He screamed her name, clawing through smoke, stumbling through collapsing beams. He woke in a sweat, heart pounding. Amari was asleep on the floor next to the couch, wrapped in a blanket, breathing softly. He got up, tucked the blanket tighter around her, and kissed her forehead. Then he walked into the kitchen, where Naomi sat reading more files. Couldn't sleep? She asked. He shook his head. Me either. He looked at her, truly looked at her. How tired her eyes were, how steady her hands still moved. Why did you help me? He asked softly. Naomi closed the file. Because I saw my own father in you. He was arrested when I was 9. Framed. Disappeared into the system. I never saw him again. I'm sorry. She nodded. So this time, I made sure the father got home. The next morning, they woke to breaking news. A new scandal. Judge Harrington was found in his home, unconscious, with a suicide note. The TV anchors speculated wildly. Pills on the floor. A confession in his handwriting. The note read, I was told to do it. I didn't start this. They used me. Wallace watched the footage from the safe house with a clenched jaw. He didn't write that. Naomi's phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. The collapse has begun. Be careful who you trust. And that afternoon, while Michael took Amari for her first walk in the park since the ruling, 2 men in suits watched from a bench across the street. One of them lowered his newspaper just enough to speak. We go for the girl next. The other nodded. The sun filtered through the trees in Lincoln Park, casting golden light across the walking paths. Children played near the fountain. Dogs barked in the distance. And for a brief, perfect moment, Michael Reed forgot that the world was hunting him. Amari held his hand, tugging him toward the carousel. Just once, Daddy. Please. Her smile, unburdened and radiant, could have moved mountains. He reached into his coat pocket and found a crumpled $5 bill Naomi had slipped him that morning. Just once, he said, pretending to grumble. But only because your old man needs to remember how to smile again. They approached the booth. As the carousel turned, its painted horses galloping in place to a broken melody, Michael lifted her onto the tallest one. She looked down at him. Are we safe now? He hesitated. We're safer. She nodded, then grabbed the pole tight as the ride began to spin. Her braids flew behind her. She was laughing again. Michael stepped back and breathed in the moment. Let himself feel it. Let himself believe in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. Then he saw the man. Across the path. Sitting on the bench. Same gray suit. Same dead eyes. No phone. No paper. Just watching. Michael froze. His body moved before his mind did, pushing past startled parents, vaulting the carousel fence. Amari. Off. Now. She stared, confused. But. Now, he barked. The ride hadn't even stopped before he yanked her into his arms and ran. Behind him, the man on the bench stood slowly. Didn't chase. Didn't call out. Just watched. 10 minutes later, Michael burst through Naomi's apartment door, still clutching Amari like a shield. Naomi was mid-call with Wallace when she saw his face. What happened? Gray suit. Bench. Watching us. Naomi was already moving, grabbing her laptop, tapping into her camera feed from the park. Where exactly? Michael pointed. North End. Bench near the carousel. She fast-forwarded the footage. There he was, Blurry. Out of place. Naomi zoomed in and froze. I know that face, she whispered. He worked in the Inspector General's office. Fired 2 years ago under sealed circumstances. Wallace's voice buzzed from the phone speaker. Name. Naomi pulled up an old ID badge. Garrett Stroud. Stroud was dirty, Wallace said immediately. Used to suppress whistleblower cases. We suspected he went private. But this, Michael, he's a fixer. If he's watching you, it means they're done hiding. Amari sat on the couch, hugging a pillow, her eyes wide. Are they going to take me again? Michael kneeled beside her. No one is taking you. Ever again. That night, Naomi worked from dusk until dawn. She pulled firewall after firewall off encrypted government emails, tracing every file connected to the CPS, Prevent Reunification program. And what she found chilled her. There were others. Dozens of them. Fathers flagged for watch lists. Children rerouted through obscure foster homes. Cases where evidence was altered, sealed, or made to disappear. But the worst part? The cases were disproportionately Black and Latino. All from high-visibility cities. And all linked to federal funding incentives tied to risk mitigation. It wasn't just corruption. It was policy. Meanwhile, in a conference room high above downtown Chicago, Garrett Stroud met with a man wearing a senator's pin. This Reed story is becoming dangerous, the senator said. It's exposing threads we can't afford to have pulled. Stroud leaned back, folding his arms. The man's been homeless for years. How is he this hard to break? Because now he has them behind him. The senator snapped. And if this hits the federal circuit, the entire system's at risk. Stroud nodded once. Then I'll go for the girl. Back in Naomi's apartment, Wallace convened a midnight call with federal agents. Reed is no longer just a client, he said. He's a key witness in a class-action civil rights case. You either protect him, or the entire country watches him fall. They agreed. Barely. By 3 a.m., agents were posted at Naomi's building. But Naomi had already made another call, this time to the south side. An old friend, a hacker turned civic tech activist. You still know how to dig through back doors. He laughed. Only on Wednesdays. Today's Wednesday. By dawn, Naomi had the missing pieces. A file, internal memo, linking Senator Harlan Bishop to the fund that underwrote the CPS risk flag system. Buried deep inside the grant language was a clause marked mitigation of high-risk parental claims in racially volatile cases. She stared at the screen. This wasn't an accident. This was engineered. Later that morning, Naomi and Michael sat on a park bench in a safer part of town, agents watching discreetly nearby. Amari ran ahead with a borrowed kite, her laughter floating higher than the cloth above her. Michael turned to Naomi. When does it end? Naomi shook her head. When they're exposed. All of them. He looked out at the field, silent for a long time. Then, I want to help find the others. The other parents. The ones who didn't make it to court. Naomi nodded. We already started building the database. Then she handed him a small folder. Inside, a birth certificate. School records. A photo of Amari with her new address. His address. You're officially her guardian again. Michael didn't move. Tears welled up, but he blinked them back. Thank you. Naomi smiled. Thank you. That night, Michael tucked Amari into bed for the first time in 3 years. She lay beneath a comforter printed with stars and planets, in a real bed, in a real room, a temporary space lent by a community shelter, but it didn't matter. She was safe. Tell me a story, she asked. Michael thought for a moment. Then he began. There once was a little girl who lived in a big city. And even though the world tried to hide her light, her father crossed fire, silence, and steel to bring her home. She was asleep before he finished. But he whispered the ending anyway. And together, they made sure the world could never forget her name. Across town, a black van sat outside a courthouse garage. Inside, Garrett Stroud checked his watch. Tomorrow, he said. We take her. For real. The city hummed like it always did, restless and unaware. But beneath the surface, power moved in silence. Garrett Stroud's van idled outside the courthouse garage, just a block from where Michael and Amari had been celebrating only days ago. In his hand was a photograph, creased and slightly worn, showing a grainy still of Amari stepping out of Naomi's car. Time-stamped. Marked. His earpiece buzzed. A voice, calm and unhurried. Proceed. No mistakes. Stroud didn't need reminding. He wasn't being paid for mistakes. Michael was up before sunrise, as he had been every day since the ruling. He stood in front of the mirror in the small, donated apartment Naomi had secured through a friend at a legal aid clinic. His beard was trimmed, his shirt freshly pressed. It still felt strange, the return to routine, to dignity. Amari padded into the room, rubbing her eyes. "Morning, Daddy," she mumbled. He lifted her into a hug. "Big day today. Do I have to talk on camera again?" "Only if you want to," he said gently. "We're going to a school board meeting, just to show them we're still here, that we're not going away." She nodded, snuggling into his shoulder. He held her like that for a long time. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in her office at the nonprofit center, finishing an email to the DOJ Civil Rights Division. Subject line: new names, new proof. In her inbox sat scanned testimonies from 6 more parents, all Black or Latino, all flagged by the same system that tried to erase Michael. One mother had lost custody after a misfiled parking ticket was used to claim instability. Another father had been deported after a clerical mistake. It was a pattern, and patterns meant strategy. Naomi leaned back, exhausted but burning. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. No message. Just a location pin. Somewhere in the west suburbs. She stared at it. Then she saw the file name on her desktop flicker. Just for a second. Then it was gone. Erased. She blinked. No. A second later, her building's power flickered. Her screen went black. Then her office door clicked open. Back at the apartment, Michael helped Amari into a warm coat. She giggled, pretending to be a marshmallow in puffed fabric. They were halfway down the stairs when his phone vibrated. Naomi's number. No text. Just a photo. It was a close-up of her office desk, overturned. The timestamp, 5 minutes ago. Michael stopped mid-step. He texted back. "Are you okay?" No reply. He turned to Amari, masking his alarm. "Change of plans, baby. We're going to see Ms. Naomi first." Naomi, bound to a chair with zip ties and a bloody lip, stared up at Stroud with loathing. He was calm, methodical, flicking through her laptop. "You really think anyone's going to believe your little class action circus? You're nothing." She laughed. "Spit blood on the floor. You're scared. That's why you're here." He leaned in. "I'm here because you wouldn't shut up. And because he won. So now he loses." He held up a second photo. Amari. At the park. His smile was cold. "I'll make sure she vanishes without a trace. Just like all the others." Naomi's eyes burned. "You won't touch her." He stood. "I already have." Michael and Amari arrived outside Naomi's building 10 minutes later. But the lights were off. A closed for maintenance sign taped to the glass. Michael didn't buy it. He saw the faint shadow in the upstairs window, a movement too sharp to be random. He pulled Amari back toward the street. "Stay with me. Don't let go." But as they turned the corner, a van skidded to a stop just ahead. 2 men in tactical gear jumped out. Michael turned to run, but another van cut them off from behind. Trapped. He shoved Amari behind a dumpster, arms spread. "You'll have to go through me," he shouted. The men closed in, guns raised. Then, freeze. A half-dozen unmarked vehicles pulled up from the side alley. U.S. Marshals. Local PD, Naomi's contact at the Civil Rights Division. Guns up. Lasers trained. "Drop your weapons." Now, the agents from the vans didn't move. For a second, it looked like they might fire. Then, slowly, they lowered their weapons. Stroud emerged from one van, hands raised, sneering. "You think this changes anything?" Michael stepped forward, trembling but tall. "You picked the wrong child." Amari ran into his arms, crying. The agents swarmed Stroud and his men. Handcuffed. Searched. Phones confiscated. The marshals found zip ties. Syringes. A burner phone with Naomi's photo. And another file. Read. Asset suppression. Phase 2. Hours later, at a secure government facility, Naomi sat on an exam table, her lips stitched, her arm bruised. She looked up as Michael walked in. "I'm okay," she said before he could ask. He sat beside her. "You saved us again." She smiled weakly. "Wasn't just me. That pin I got, the one with the location, came from Wallace. He figured they'd go after me first." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. "They almost took her. But they didn't," she said. "And now we have everything." The next day, at a press conference in front of the Capitol, Wallace stood beside Michael, Naomi, and Amari, flanked by senators, civil rights leaders, and dozens of parents with similar stories. A sea of microphones. Dozens of flashing lights. Michael stepped up to the podium. He didn't use notes. He didn't need them. Some of us have lived in the shadows our whole lives. We've been told we were unfit, unstable, unsafe. But the truth is, the system was scared of us, of what would happen if we stood together. He looked down at Amari, who held his hand. She is the reason I survived. And now I fight for the ones who didn't. He lifted a stack of sealed case files. For every name in this folder, we demand justice. The crowd roared. That night, in a secure facility outside the city, a man watched the speech on a muted television. Garrett Stroud. In a holding cell. He smiled faintly, then whispered to himself. They won the battle. But the war never ends. The storm outside D.C. that night was the kind you felt in your bones. Thunder that shook windows and rain that beat the streets like war drums. Inside the Justice Department's Civil Rights Building, Naomi sat with Wallace and a federal task force, staring at a digital map that pulsed with red pins. Each one was a name. Each pin, a family. Each point, a child taken. And each, somehow, connected to the same web of corrupted custody rulings, forged psychological evaluations, and policy memos crafted with surgical racism disguised as risk mitigation. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her voice hoarse. This is bigger than anything we thought. Wallace rubbed his temple. It's not just about one judge anymore, or even one agency. This is coordinated policy. Quiet genocide through bureaucracy. One of the agents turned to them, pale. You realize what you're saying would implicate dozens of officials, state and federal. You're talking about a systemic civil rights crime on a national scale. Yes, Wallace said, looking up. We are. Michael and Amari, now in temporary protective custody just outside Baltimore, were trying to breathe in the new silence. The government had placed them in a modest brick house with gated fencing, guarded 24/7. It wasn't home, but it wasn't the street. And for Amari, it was enough to feel safe. They sat on the floor, a bowl of popcorn between them, watching The Lion King. She leaned her head against his chest, and for once, her laughter wasn't anxious or forced. But Michael couldn't focus on Simba. His eyes kept drifting to the window, to the stillness. He didn't trust it. The door buzzed. One of the marshals stepped in. Sir, there's a video call for you. From Naomi and Justice Wallace. Secure line. Michael kissed Amari's forehead. I'll be right back. He entered the small den, sat in front of the laptop, and clicked accept. Naomi's face filled the screen, her voice serious. They found something. She pulled up a document Wallace had decrypted only hours before, a government contract between the Department of Health and Human Services and a private tech firm called Pathshare Analytics. At first glance, it was a standard data monitoring contract. But buried in the appendices? A clause authorizing predictive risk flagging of families using a proprietary algorithm. Michael stared at it. What kind of risk? Wallace answered. The kind that uses race, income level, zip code, and education to forecast whether a parent is likely to fail. Michael's throat went dry. Like me. Naomi nodded. You were flagged the moment Dana died. The system didn't care who you were. They only saw your skin, your grief, and your poverty. You never had a chance. Wallace leaned forward. We take this to court. Class action. On behalf of every flagged parent. We argue that this algorithm is a modern eugenics tool, coded discrimination dressed as science. Michael sat back, stunned. But we'll need more families, Naomi said. More survivors. I'll find them, Michael said. Every single one. But in the shadows of Capitol Hill, the resistance was already building. Inside a private townhouse in Georgetown, Senator Harlan Bishop met with 2 CEOs and a DHS representative. The Pathshare logo blinked from a laptop screen in the center of the table. We can't let this case go to trial, Bishop growled. If they argue this algorithm was racially coded, we're done. Every federal agency that used it is complicit. We've already scrubbed most of the early code commits, one of the tech reps said. And the whistleblowers? The DHS rep asked. Handled. Bishop turned to the window, watching the rain. Then we do this the old way. We break the story. Not the facts, the people. He handed them 2 folders. Michael read. Naomi Temple. Destroy their credibility. Before they destroy us. The next day, a media storm erupted. A right-wing news site published a story titled, Reed's Rise, Welfare Fraud, Fake Victimhood, and the Left's New Poster Father. The article included heavily edited clips from Michael's court hearings, doctored social worker quotes, and even an old mugshot from a protest arrest when he was in college, mischaracterized as domestic terrorism. Worse, a supposed leaked video surfaced, edited to look like Naomi coaching witnesses to lie. Naomi slammed her laptop shut. "They're coming for our names," she whispered. Wallace wasn't surprised. This is what empires do when truth threatens power. They smear the messenger. But this, she hesitated, looking at Michael on her second screen, who had just read the article. This could get us killed. Michael was quiet. He didn't rage, didn't cry. He simply opened his journal, the one he'd written in since the viaduct, and began to write. Day 1. They tried to erase me again. But I am still here. I am still writing. And they cannot kill what they cannot understand. That night, Amari had a nightmare. She woke up screaming. "They took you. Daddy, they took you again." Michael rushed to her, heart aching. "No, baby. I'm here. I'm right here." She clung to him like she'd never let go. "I don't want to be brave anymore," she sobbed. He kissed the top of her head. "Then you don't have to be. I'll be brave for both of us." Outside, floodlights cast long shadows across the lawn. A car passed slowly. Inside the car, a man with a camera zoomed in on the window, capturing the embrace. Then dialed a number. "They look vulnerable," he said. The reply was calm, chilling. "Make them look criminal." The next morning, Michael woke up to banging on the door. It wasn't the marshals. It was CPS. Again, holding a new risk report, claiming social instability, claiming media exposure was endangering the child. Amari stood behind Michael, holding his hand. He looked at the agent dead in the eye and said, "You're going to have to arrest me first." The agent hesitated, then handed him a court summons. Michael opened it and froze. Emergency hearing. Motion to revoke custody. Filed by Senator Harlan Bishop's office. Naomi called seconds later. "Michael," she said, breathless. "They're trying to take her again." His voice was low, flat, cold. "Then they better bring an army." The courthouse steps loomed like a cliff face as Michael stood beneath the rising sun, Amari's small hand clutched in his. Naomi walked beside them, her face tight with tension, a folder of counterfilings pressed to her chest. Across the plaza, federal marshals stood like sentries, their presence a warning to anyone thinking of pulling another stunt. The press was there too, in force. This wasn't a quiet hearing. This was a showdown. And the world was watching. Inside the courtroom, Michael saw him, Senator Harlan Bishop. Tall, smug, dressed in a tailored Navy suit. He sat at the plaintiff's table with a team of attorneys, flanked by 2 CPS representatives and an expert psychologist whose credentials had already been questioned in Naomi's internal report. Michael didn't blink. The judge, an older Latino woman with a reputation for incorruptibility, entered the courtroom. Her eyes swept the room like a searchlight before settling on Michael. "Let's begin." The hearing opened with CPS presenting new evidence, a hastily compiled risk report citing Michael's unregulated environment, high-profile media exposure, and potential trauma to Amari caused by her continued involvement in a national political firestorm. Their expert, a Dr. Kelman, argued that Amari needed stability and silence. Michael leaned over to Naomi. "She's already had silence. 3 years of it." Naomi nodded. "Then speak loud enough to bury them." The judge turned to Bishop's team. "You're seeking emergency revocation of custody. That's an extraordinary motion. Justify it." One of the attorneys stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Reed has been exposed in national media as a man of questionable character. He's a destabilizing presence, and his recent associations with known political radicals place the child at risk." "Objection," Naomi snapped, rising. "There is no evidence to support these claims. They're citing doctored videos and media speculation, not facts." The judge held up a hand. "Ms. Temple, you'll have time to respond." Michael was silent, listening, learning, waiting. Then the judge called him to the stand. He stood slowly, straightened his collar, walked with the steadiness of a man who had stood before fire and didn't fear it anymore. He raised his hand, swore his truth. Then he began. "I've been called a lot of things in the past year," he said. "Dangerous, radical, homeless, unstable. But none of those people ever saw what my daughter sees when she looks at me." He looked down at Amari in the gallery. She smiled, just slightly. "I was targeted. Yes, I was broken down. Yes, I slept in alleys while people like Senator Bishop dined on steak and rewrote the law to erase people like me. Murmurs. The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't stop him. But through it all, I stayed a father. That never changed. I read the law. I studied the Constitution in a public library with no coat on. I fought for my child with the only weapons I had, my mind, my voice, and my love. He reached into his coat and pulled out the napkin he'd written his first letter to Amari on. I wrote this the day after I lost her. I carried it with me every day, and I promised her, in ink and faith, that I would come back, that I would not be erased. He held it up. I kept that promise. The courtroom was still. Even Bishop looked uneasy now. Then Naomi stood. Your Honor, with permission, we would like to submit additional evidence. The judge nodded. Naomi handed over a thick folder, hundreds of pages. This is the original CPS algorithm. Decrypted. It uses race, income, and neighborhood data to classify parents as high risk before any investigation. And Mr. Reed was one of thousands flagged this way. Gasps. Bishop's lawyers jumped up. That file is inadmissible. It was obtained illegally. Naomi raised a hand. It was obtained through a whistleblower protection statute. You'll find the affidavit inside. The judge flipped through the first few pages, then paused, then looked up. Mr. Bishop, please approach the bench. The senator's jaw tightened. Your Honor, with all due respect. Now, he approached. She leaned in and whispered, do you want to continue this case under full discovery, with federal agents watching? Because I'll grant that motion today. Bishop paled and sat back down. That afternoon, the judge returned from recess with her ruling. The room was packed now. Word had spread. Cameras outside. Protesters on the steps. Reporters live-streaming to millions. Naomi squeezed Michael's hand. Amari sat beside Wallace, her small legs swinging beneath the bench. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, the judge began, I find no legal basis to revoke custody from Mr. Reed. In fact, she paused. It appears this motion was not only unwarranted, but politically motivated, filed in bad faith, and grounded in an unconstitutional profiling system. Therefore, she looked directly at the senator. I am referring this matter for federal review. Effective immediately, Bishop stood abruptly. This is outrageous. This is justice, she cut in. Bang of the gavel. The courtroom erupted. Wallace stood, his face unreadable but eyes shining. Naomi exhaled, then let herself smile. And Michael, he didn't cheer. He didn't collapse. He simply turned to Amari, knelt down, and whispered, we made it. She threw her arms around his neck. Outside, as they stepped into the sunlight, Michael was swarmed by cameras. But this time, he didn't flinch. He held Amari's hand, spoke clearly. I'm not going to disappear back into the shadows now that I won. I'm not just a father. I'm a witness. And I'm not done speaking. Naomi stood beside him, nodding. Wallace whispered to her, he's becoming more than a symbol. She nodded. He's becoming a movement. But as they turned to leave, a reporter shouted, Mr. Reed, did you hear about Stroud? Michael turned. The reporter held up a phone. Headline, Garrett Stroud escapes federal custody during transport. He's missing, the reporter said. What do you plan to do? Michael's smile disappeared. And quietly, with Amari's hand in his, he said, I plan to finish what they started. Rain blanketed Washington, D.C., in a gray hush. It fell steady and cold, soaking the marble steps of the federal courthouse where Michael Reed had been summoned for what many were already calling the most significant civil rights deposition of the decade. Inside, in a private chamber, Michael stood beside Naomi and Justice Wallace. Amari waited just outside, guarded by 2 federal marshals. She was reading a book, The People Could Fly, gifted to her by a librarian who had once snuck Michael coffee and a blanket when he was homeless. Now, her father was about to testify in a class action lawsuit that could shake the country to its core. The room was quiet, formal, tense. A long table, DOJ attorneys on one side, the defense counsel for the federal agencies, expressionless men in dark suits, on the other. At the head sat the presiding judge, recently assigned from an emergency judicial panel. She had been a civil rights litigator in her former life. Her eyes were tired, sharp, and deeply aware of the moment. Justice Wallace nodded at Michael. You're ready. Michael took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, not perfectly, just enough to show effort. Then he raised his right hand. swore in, and began. His deposition lasted hours. He spoke of data systems disguised as justice, of racial profiling wrapped in bureaucratic language. He named the trauma, poverty criminalized, grief pathologized, fatherhood stolen, and sold to headlines that never asked for his side. He read letters, some of them his, others written by fathers and mothers who never made it back. He named senators, named judges, named tech companies, and he named Garrett Stroud. The courtroom listened. The nation watched. And in a moment that would replay for years on television and social media, Michael said, "I was never unstable. I was unprotected. There's a difference." The judge leaned forward. "What do you ask this court for today, Mr. Reed?" Michael didn't blink. "I ask for exposure, for accountability, and most of all, truth, because that's the only thing that keeps history from repeating." By evening, the courtroom had emptied. Naomi leaned against a pillar in the hall, exhausted but victorious. Wallace pulled Michael aside. "That was revolutionary." Michael exhaled. "It still won't bring back the years." "No," Wallace said, "but it may keep another father from losing his." The next morning, the DOJ announced the launch of a full-scale investigation into PathSure Analytics, CPS funding structures, and the profiling algorithm used in 13 states. Senator Bishop was subpoenaed. Judges across Illinois resigned. Whistleblowers came forward. And Michael Reed versus State of Illinois officially became a federal class action case with over 230 named plaintiffs. The tide was turning. But then, a security breach, a late-night alert. Garrett Stroud had been sighted. In Chicago, the same viaduct where Michael once slept had become a temporary memorial. Candles, handwritten signs. "Thank you." Michael scrawled across concrete in chalk. And that's where they spotted him. Blurry security footage. A man in a hood, setting fire to the memorial. A final message. "Erase him." Again. Michael received the news the next morning. He sat quietly in Naomi's office, watching the footage, flames dancing where hope had once flickered. "What do you want to do?" she asked gently. Michael stared at the screen, then turned to Naomi. "We go home." That afternoon, he returned to Chicago, Amari by his side. They walked beneath the same overpass where he once curled on cardboard. But now, the soot had been washed away, replaced by a mural of his face, bold and fierce, looking up like a prophet into the future. Amari's hand tightened in his. "Are we safe now?" she asked. Michael looked around. The sirens were gone. The shadows, retreating. "No," he said honestly. "But we're seen." She nodded. "That's something." They stood there for a long moment, father and daughter, two survivors in the ruins of a war they never asked for, finally given a voice loud enough to echo. Then he turned away, and they walked home. Epilogue, 1 year later. The Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision, Reed versus Illinois. The ruling, racial profiling via algorithmic risk flagging, violates the 14th Amendment. A victory. Real. Concrete. Law. Michael stood on the courthouse steps, now in a tailored suit. Not expensive, but his. Paid for by his first paycheck as the new director of a national nonprofit called Fathers Forward. Amari was now in 4th grade. Her latest book report was about Ruby Bridges. Naomi was speaking at Harvard next month. Wallace retired, but not before telling Michael. History is made by those who refuse to vanish. And Michael? He didn't vanish. He spoke. He fought. He won.